Uh, we going? Okay. So we'll try to bring you up to date as far as we can. This picture that you see there in the corner is the bridge just before they put the decking on back in 1992. And this is after the rails and everything were removed from the bridge after the railroad had gone out of business. The railroad ran out of business. I'll get to that here in a minute in 85. I've got a lot of pictures of the bridge, so you can just enjoy these. This doesn't mean much, but this does show you, for those of you that recall, the old way that we used to get up onto the bridge. And this was built by volunteers to put this together during the time that this picture was taken back in the last decade. So why'd they put the bridge here? Aside from the fact that they didn't build a lot of railway bridges real close on the east side, they did, the east side of the Sound, real close to the water, because I'll show you the layout of some of the towns along here. But they wanted to build the bridge, or they wanted to build the railway so that it generally was in a fairly level thing, because as probably most of you know, railroad trains don't climb grades very well. 1-2% about the best that they do for most mainline railway. They had a lot of small railways line here, and I'll show you some of those in a minute, and that were used primarily for logging. And some of those would climb 5 or 6% grades and would work on uneven track. A lot of those were narrow gauge. Let me know if you can't hear me in the back there. So this is some of the towns that were primarily set up to harvest timber, where timber mills and so forth were set up along the strait. And notice, with very few exceptions, they're right on the water, because that was the way they brought the timber out. The timber all went to the water. It either went down the rivers. Am I standing in your way, John? And so some of these towns exist still, or at least the communities do, but a good number of them have kind of gone by the wayside. Notice that Port Angeles isn't shown on here, and neither is Sequim. But this is what the primary reason that the Olympic Peninsula was famous and an economical success was because of the timber, and that was the principal motivation to get the timber out. And the timber, until the time the railroad came, all went to the water, and then was either milled by mills that were on the water, or was rafted up into large timber rafts and was taken off and was milled over in the east part of the Sound, and the other mills on the other side. So going back a little bit into history, and I'll show you a blow up of this map in a minute, but notice that this was back in the 1850s. And at that time, a gentleman named Jefferson Davis, who had some other fame a little bit later on. Urge voters to reject a Republican takeover. That's not me. Can you mute our people online? Because I think that's where it was coming from. But Jeff Davis, before he had another job in 1860, was the Secretary of War. And he famously was one of the gentlemen that brought camels to the United States. If any of you remember that history. And that didn't work out too well, so they turned them loose in the desert, and they roamed around Arizona and New Mexico for a few years. I think they all died out. I think there's some that were seen, I think, as late as 1900 or so. Notice that the state of Arizona is missing from this map, as is a couple others, if you can think about it. How about Idaho and Wyoming? But this was drawn up quickly, and This gentleman right here is the one that sketched this up. He was an engineer, and he had another claim to fame. Have any of you ever been to Gettysburg? Been to Little Round Top? This is General Warren here, and he's the one that found the Confederate forces attacking Little Round Top and moved forces to block the advance of the Confederate forces on the second day of Gettysburg. If he hadn't been there and done that, why probably there would not have been a third day of Gettysburg. The war would have been, or the battle at least would have been over at that time. Anyway, he was an engineer and he laid out some of these tracks, and these are sketches of where they were. I thought it's interesting to note blowing up Washington on this map. These maps come out of the Library of Congress. See the very careful and thoughtful alignment of rail line here, running up from Olympia up to Port Townsend. And Port Townsend was envisioned, as many of you probably know, as to be, it was going to be the Queen City of Washington. It was going to be the port. It was going to be the San Francisco, essentially, and then all of a sudden they discovered that there's a mountain or two along the Hood Canal that would have been a little difficult to run rails through without expending, it's not that they couldn't have bored tunnels and made it happen, but it didn't pencil out economically. And so Port Townsend kind of withered, and the towns on the, the east side of the Sound were the ones that got the railroads and got the economic development. And also you'll notice here, if you're familiar with the land grant programs that started in the 1850s, and these were given to large railroads to build the railroads. And so they were given these big tracts of land, and they look like checkerboards of this nature here on either side of the rail line. Sometimes they would extend, they're 1 mile checkerboards on either side of the rail line, and they would extend sometimes 10 or 15 miles away from the trace of the line rail. In some cases, they were 50 or 60 miles on either side of the rail line. You can see in Washington at the time that these were granted, almost a half of the state was in these land grants. But you notice one part of the state that didn't have any land grants in it, and that's where we're sitting tonight. So there were no land grants on the Upper Olympic Peninsula for railroad construction. One of the reasons that the Olympic Trails Coalition, when they started to go out and put the trails in to build trails here, had to go back and try to either recapture or reinitiate the railroad right-of-ways that were established for the rail line that was the one that crossed our bridge here. And you can see these are range and township lines that are laid out all around the peninsula. See Puget Sound, Seattle down here. And that's the way, these are the survey lines that were set up for the plats of land for ownership. And these go back, of course, to the 1880s, but no railway lines were established at that time. The rails came late to the Olympic Peninsula. And here's some rail plots up here. Now, the concept line that they originally had thought about bringing up from Olympia up to Port Townsend, they didn't have it envisioned by the 1880s. They'd kind of given up on it being very difficult to build and not economically sound, because when they brought the cross-country railroads into Washington, and Washington was not a state yet, it didn't become a state until 1889. There wasn't the commercial value in putting the effort into putting a railroad up here. So we needed to start thinking about getting rails to here. And here's what they decided to do, and this was decision-making was happening about 1900. And here you can see the alignment that was acquired by the Milwaukee Road from Port Townsend to out, all the way out to Deep Creek, almost to Fisk, There was some concept of taking it all the way to Clallam Bay at one point. That didn't happen. But you can see some of the other rail lines that are on here. This, of course, is the Spruce Railway, and that was built by the Army starting in, I think it was 1915 until 1918, and they finished it so that it could carry rail traffic in November of 1918. And the reason that they built it was to get spruce wood out so that they could build aircraft for World War I. But what else happened in November of 1918? Yeah, the war ended. But the rail, the timber companies and the railroad, that line was tied in to these, and they did use it to get rail out of the, the western part of Clallam County. But you can see some of the other small little lines that used to be here. These were narrow gauge ones that were out of Carlsberg. Of course, there was a big mill at Carlsberg. There, at one time, around 1914, 1915, there were rail lines that ran all the way out to the top of the Dungeness Spit. And these were just temporary narrow gauge lines that were strictly built to get the timber out. And then as soon as the timber was in an area where they could readily get it to the rail line, they'd pick the rail line up and move it and then use it. Because one thing they didn't have an abundance of here was roads. Roads came very late to the Olympic Peninsula that you travel over. You've all heard probably, if you've lived in Washington for a while, and those of you who are new, of the mosquito fleets. And the mosquito fleets were the ones that ran along the coastline, and you can see the various, and there were all kinds of little fleets, all these dotted lines that you see on the water, were all these little lines that used to run in and out with all of the port cities where they were along the Strait of Juan de Fuca, on Hood Canal, all up and down the Sound. And that was the way that people communicated with each other. That's the way you moved agricultural goods. That's the way you moved timber for a lot of, there wasn't a lot of timber moved in the mosquito fleet, but it's primarily, they moved animals. And, if you wanted to go to Seattle for the weekend or something like that, you go get on a boat on Friday and go to Seattle and come back on Sunday or Monday. But that's the way that people communicated for a long time in Washington. When I first moved to Washington in 1960, I was stationed at Fort Lewis. There wasn't even a good set of roads here in the Olympic Peninsula, but you can readily circumnavigate this peninsula as late as that. I mean, there were roads that you could get through on, but they were not really great. So our bridge is a Howe truss. It was designed by this gentleman, William Howe. First built, the first typical room, the bridge that he started building was in the 1830s. He got his patent then in the 50s. They were adopted by numerous railroads because they took advantage of the capability of both timber and iron, and he was the first one that did this. They were delivered to the sites in pre-cut timbers so that they could be erected by unskilled labor. So you didn't have to have specialized millwrights and so forth to come in and put it together. They were all pre-cut, pre-drilled, and you had all of the parts that went to the kit, essentially, like an erector set. And they were put, so they could be put together with a track gang, and that's still normally the way that they did that. The unique features of the bridge, and I'll show you pictures of this exactly, but basic truss configuration is built out of a series of triangles, and a triangle is a rigid structure, when you've got it tied together. And they used at first iron and then a wrought iron to build these steel rods together, and then they could be tensioned either by putting threaded ends on a thing and screwing them down against a plate, or sometimes they use turnbuckles to tighten the iron up so that it would tight. And the compression load that these bridges took was taken by the timber, and the tension load was taken by the steel. And originally iron, and then eventually they used steel in the bridges. This is where you have to pay attention to your engineering. What you see up there is a distributed wire load like a train going across the bridge. And you see a beam, and in some cases, just a solid beam. And you've seen a lot of bridges that just have a beam across the thing. And that puts a lot of flex on it. Well, when you go and put the triangles on top of this beam, and you start taking, the shear load is carried at the abutments. And you can see that roughly half the shear load goes to each side of the bridge. And then the moment load, or the bending load on it, is maximum in the center and it's minimum at the end, because the shear load is what picks up on the abutments. So the two different types of loads that a bridge has to be taken into consideration when you design it is that you have to be able to handle both the dead load, which is the weight of the structure itself, and the live load, which is the load that you want the bridge to carry: people, cars, trains, and so forth. There'll be a test at the end of any of you. You got the formulas down? No. The other thing is that, I got a lot of qualifications in here, but the loads that you pick up on these bridge members are essentially what you call axial. In other words, they go from one end of the load to the other, one end of the member to the other. There's no loads picked up in the middle of these, either the steel or the timber. The loads are all picked up at the end. And so they're introduced at the joint points where the timber and the steel meet. And as I'd mentioned, were all cut to size for the particular bridge. And this 150-foot bridge is what ours out here was kind of a kit bridge that, they'd say, I need a 150-foot howe truss, and it needs to be delivered to this site. We'll, get it assembled. And it could be built in two different ways, and I'll show you pictures of them. One of them, I got my training aid here. One of them would be a through truss like this, where the train goes through it, or else it could be built as a deck truss like this, where the train goes on top of it and the trusses are underneath. And you can use the same basic design for the truss for both of those configurations. And you can see that now if you were hauling logs and say one of your cincher cables broke on a log on a flat car and it got skewed and was sticking out the side of the flat car as you came, what would happen to the bridge in this consideration? You could lose the bridge. So their preference was to build them like this, so that if that happened, because they didn't go with handrails or anything like that on the bridges, or anything on top of the bridge, just the rails. And I'll show you a picture here in just a minute. However, in cases like this, what would have happened if they built a deck truss across the, wouldn't work, because either that or you have to build the railroad way up in the air. And of course, that was expensive. You have to build trestle, and it'd have a long slope to it to get you up in the air so that you could build a truss like this. Often when I've done this class before, we've gone out on the bridge, and I can show you these places, but I'll make do with pictures here tonight. Here are your tensioning rods that you see, steel rods. You can see the channel irons underneath and the bolts coming through, and those are cinched up and threaded up to pull them up tight, and the timber. Notice the metal, and that's why I said and that thing where sort of these things came together like this. There are parts of metal that were used in trusses before Howe's design came in, where he was the first one to introduce using the tensioned steel members in addition to the timber. They also use these bearing plates, and as any of you who worked with timber, when you have timber bearing on another piece of wood and you put load on it, it tends to embed itself into the wood. So to spread that load, you had these keyed cast iron bearing plates, and you can see them up on our bridge. We used to be able to walk down here and I could, touch them on the side of the bridge. Now you'd have to climb over the handrail, which I don't advise, and get down to see them, but these things are on the side of the bridge. Here's the lower chord of the bridge here. And of course, those are the upright compression timbers that are taking the compression load of the truss. And then if you look up, you see this kind of lattice set of triangles up at the top of the bridge. Those really don't carry any load. What they do is keep the the truss portions aligned, because you can see if they fell in or like this, you'd lose the structural integrity of the decking of the bridge that you wanted. So that's why you have to put those loads up there. And some of those timbers, they've gone out and have done, the tribe just recently hired a group of engineers to come out and survey this bridge. And they found a number of these upright timbers. Mainly they're on the west end of the bridge. These timbers here have been attacked by carpenter ants. And so you have some of them that, the carpenter ants are pretty clever. They just eat the inside. They don't eat the outside, because that's all creosoted and nasty, which is supposed to keep them out. But they get into the inside. And so some of there are hollow cores in some of these. However, not to fear. What was the bridge designed to carry? 150-ton, railway engines and cars and things like that. So I don't think that we're in serious trouble right now, although they are looking at various ways to go out and either replace certain pieces. And that was an advantage of this design, is you could pull a timber out if a timber was damaged by, say, a loose log hitting it, or it got damaged through loading or something of that nature, or carpenter ants. You could pull it out and put another one back in. You didn't want to do it when a train was coming across you, obviously, but you did have the capability of replacing parts in these fairly easily, and you could order, I need part number 57 for this 150-foot Howe truss, and they'd ship you out one and you could put it in. This is what this looked like when this is a Seattle North Coast rail line that was going through it at that time. Here's the other bridge that I was telling you about, and this is the deck configuration. Here's the truss underneath and the train running across the top of it. And you can see what most of them were carrying, almost exclusively timber. Now, in the latter years of the railroad, they also hauled a lot of newsprint and pulpwood and things of that nature, primarily for paper and cardboard making. But this is the reason that the railroad was built. But you'll also notice in this picture something that they did for a short period of time, from about the 1920s to the mid-30s. It was actually the Depression that kind of knocked it out. Is they used to have passenger cars on this line. And in the latter part of the 30s, they had just little gasoline-powered like jitney cars, where you could pick up almost like a bus, where you could get on and ride the rails from town to town, and you could do that when the timber trains weren't running. Then you could run the passenger, much like the way Amtrak has to run today. when the freight trains come through, Amtrak goes on the siding, and then they get back on when the paying customers are there. I got a lot of these pictures from Steve Huff. I don't know if any of you knew Steve Huff. He was the county engineer for a long time. He's a real railroad enthusiast. And this bridge was built with parts and pieces that were loaded and brought in by ship and barge to Port Angeles, and then were hauled east back to the river. So that's the, they loaded up these work trains. I don't know if they're parts of the bridge there, but they look like they're cut timbers. I suspect they probably are bridge parts that were loaded up in Port Angeles after they came off the shipping, and then were loaded onto cars and driven out to the site on the rail line. Again, road options were not the way because there just weren't any good dependable roads. There were certainly wagon tracks that went across here, but paved roads with good designed road beds to them just didn't exist. So here's what our bridge looked like in June, July of 1915. And the way these things were put together is they would come in first and put these log cribs here and here, and these are just timber cribs filled with rocks. And then they would come in and put these false intermediate vents in here, and those are just laid down in the river. And then you'd come in and lay the stringers across, and as you got the stringers put across, then you could run railway cars out on the stringers supported by this, and then you could do the upright erection. If you see in here, there's a gin pole, and that's what they use to raise the timbers. It's a pole with a hook on it. It's got a member in the middle of it. You can't see all of that. It's hidden down in here, and then you pull down on one side and you can lift the timbers up to do the, lift up the steel and the upper connections and the upper cord and all that. And you can see all the pre-cut timber is right here. Of course, you don't want to go much beyond there until you get that portion built. This is looking at the river from the south and looking back toward the northwest. The Port Angeles would be in this direction, and Sequim would be in that direction. So these are some clips out of the newspaper file. The pre-runner, predecessor of the Sequim Gazette, as to when the bridge was actually being built. You can see that they started here actually putting the bridge together. They did pre-grading on it in 1914. They graded out, took trees out and graded the roadbed. And then they could get the rails out here because, again, they were dependent on the train to move all their construction material and their crews. And then they started actually building the bridge in late May, early June of 1915. And they had traffic on it in Sequim by the middle of July here of 1915. They didn't have to wait for the environmental control, and they didn't have to wait for somebody to tell them when the fish windows occurred in the river. I would say that probably environmental concerns for this construction were not high on their priority. These guys were, probably paid by the hour, and they were paid by the getting the bridge done within the timelines they had. So it was get those bridges in. You can notice the in the other picture there, the debris and so forth that was left in the river, and they would try to do it during low water times. They were right down in the water when they were putting these things together. So it was a different era of construction than what we live in now. I thought this is an interesting photo that I dug out. This is Port Townsend, 1922. This is where Kai Tai, if you're familiar with Port Townsend, Kai Tai Lagoon was here. The Safeway would be right about here. This is where the yacht harbor would be. But here is the railway terminus. That was the east end of the railway that ran through Squim. And it ran, you would bring a barge in, hook it up there, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And then here was the line that branched off here and went into Port Townsend. That was their railway service. And here was the line that came out along the shoreline, went by where the mill is in Port Townsend now. And then it came out along the peninsula, came into Discovery Bay. Here's what it looked like. This was taken toward the end of the railroad's life, but they ran obviously on a tide table rather than a timetable, because you had to have the tide at the right height to get the barge in, to get these trains that don't climb grades very well. It's not like a car ferry where you can go up or down on a ramp like we do getting back and forth to the other side now. You had to have that almost matched. So you had to watch your tides very closely and then get your rail cars loaded on the barge. There's a barge sitting right out here. And that's the way you got the empty cars onto the Northern Olympic Peninsula, and you got the full cars off the Olympic Peninsula. You can imagine a sea captain sailing in Puget Sound on a foggy day, and up in front of him is a train. That would get your attention. But that's the way they moved these train cars back and forth across the sound at that point in time. They'd have a tugboat go with them, and they would move 10 or 15 cars at a time on these barges and move them from one side of the sound to the other. Here's what it looked like in 2009, was one of the last years it existed. The trains, of course, had gone, the tracks are gone off of the trestles and so forth. And of course, this is the trestle that went into Port Townsend, and that's gone. And if you go over there today, the whole thing's gone. and it should be. These were heavy creosoted timbers. They also rotted out when they were in salt water. They had probably a lifespan of 15 to 20 years, and that was about it. And they had to be replaced constantly. And of course, any number of things, when you put timber in salt water, it deteriorates quite rapidly, even regardless of protection. And the washout that we had here in where we lost a section of the bridge on the west side of the trestle in 2015, 2016. We had the precursor of that happen in 1961, where almost where we're sitting here, this could be the view from right about here, looking toward the bridge, and all the trestle parts. You can see portions of it down here that washed out with a major flood that hit the river at that point. And this, of course, reduced rail traffic significantly. And what the railroad did to correct the situation, this is all railroad work. Again, they went through extensive environmental reviews of all the work they did. They came out and built a dike from here to here. And it was they just pushed up gravel from out of the river. There were car bodies in it. There may have been real bodies in it. I don't know for sure, but they just stacked up enough to, push the river back under the bridge because they didn't want it on this side of the bridge where the trestles were. And then they came back in here and drove piling and built the bridge on out to put the railway back in operation. Now, during the entire time that this bridge was in operation, you had constant maintenance that had to be done on the piling and on the bridge itself. The west end and the east end were a series of trestles, and they were about 14 to 17 feet apart of rows of pile bents to drive the piling down. And you had the pile driver was sitting on a railway car at that time, and you'd drive the piling from sitting on the car, and you'd fix that bent, and you could roll the car a little bit further. Again, you know, they didn't have truck traffic, or you couldn't do that to bring things in. You had to bring everything on the rail, so everything had to be in, you know, close proximity to your rail operation. They even picked the entire bridge itself up, because they did this in the 50s. You see these concrete, you know, abutments that were put in at that point in time. They wanted to get the bridge off of the original cribbing that they put on it. So they went down and moved the bridge about 4 or 5, maybe 10 feet west, and came in from this side, you know, when the trestle was in, and then put piling down in the drove big H piling down into the bottom of the river and put the concrete cap on top of the bridge, on top of the abutment. And they did the same thing on the east side, moved the bridge back this way. And they picked it up with big railway cranes from that side and then slid it back so that it rests on the pilings, on the abutments they have right now. Here's one of the last pictures that I've been able to locate of the road when it was still run by the Milwaukee Road. And this is crossing the bridge. And you can see it's looking towards Squim. You can see the concrete abutments that were put in the 50s. They put these concrete abutments in at that point. Notice the guardrails on the bridge. This is typical. Anytime you see a rail line and it crosses something like a bridge or any type of a structure where you want control, you want to reduce as much as you can the opportunity for derailment. Derailing on a bridge is kind of a bad idea. So you want to be careful with that. But you can see the bridge in the shape that it was in. This is when Milwaukee Road was still running the bridge. These are some pictures in 1979, 1980. The Milwaukee Road sold the line to the Seattle North Coast Railroad. And the pictures that we have of most of the trains that ran over the rails at that point, from that point on, are the ones in these green and yellow livery. And this is what a train would look like. Probably hauling newsprint or something like that in the boxcars. This is the old Squim Railway Depot. Many of you old timers remember that. They took that out when they built the bypass. There was a restaurant at the time. They took it out. Yeah, when the railroad abandoned it. Well, of course, the railroad ran through Squim. You know, there's the big towers whereby the Serenity House there between 5th and 6th Street is where the rail line ran right through the middle of Squim. And this was the depot. No, this is south of Washington Street. Yeah, about 3rd. It was, I think, between 2nd and 3rd Street, and it's almost where the 3rd Street overpass on the bypass is. It was a little bit east of that. One of the ideas when they were using, when the Seattle Peaks folks put it together, is that they were going to run a dinner train out here. And so people would be an excursion, you'd pick you up and bring you to the ferry over in probably Edmonds or someplace like that, come across, get on at Port Townsend, ride the train across the Olympic Peninsula to Port Townsend. Here's where the Red Lion is right now. They're just, and if you'll notice in Port Townsend, if you're ever going down near the ferry, you see Railroad Street. You pay attention to that. That's where the railroad line was, right down there on the waterfront. Of course, it was advantageous to do that. Excuse me. But anyway, it's kind of interesting to see the passenger cars back on. There had been an absence of passenger traffic, and this only ran, I think they ran 2 or 3. Is Shirley here tonight? I didn't see her come in. Shirley's father organized one of the trips, obviously when the train was running, I think about 1983, with a whole bunch of Audubon folks, and they rode the train from Port Angeles to Port Townsend. Probably came back too, I don't know. Okay. At this point, when the Seattle North Coast was doing, it didn't cross the Elwha River. It just stayed in. The last train, I think, that crossed the Elwha River was, I think, in the mid-30s, because they had gotten all the easily harvested timber that was close to that at that point. And by that time, the road network was coming up, and it wasn't economical to go back and put that bridge in. I think they lost it in a big, of course, the dams went in at that point. The bridge, if you know where the new bridge is, that has the underslung, that has the bicycle path underneath it. That bridge that I showed you that had the steam engine and had the log train on it, that was just a little bit downstream of where that bridge is today. There used to be an old highway bridge that ran across there. It was old single lane steel truss highway bridge. It was just upstream of where that bicycle underpass bridge is now. So these are kind of some key points that I think it's useful to kind of keep in mind. These are the people here that built the original bridge, and these and built the original rail line and operated it, I would say, probably during its profitable years. And they acquired the land and the property without the benefit of the land grant program, where almost all of the railroads that you see in eastern Washington and all up and down the west and across the other, western states, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, those were all, land grant things, and people made enormous amounts of money. People like the Vanderbilts and the Huntingtons and Crocker and all of those guys. Who were the four? I'll have to think of all four of the guys. Mark Hopkins, the guys that made all the big money in California. A lot of them did that based on their holdings, the railroad and the railroad lines. And I want to show you the condition of the rail line just before they lost it. Notice the weeding of that's not indicative of high-class rail line. Notice the speed of the train also. This is the max speed that it was allowed to go because the condition of the track was so bad. They only had 2 engines on this entire, when the South Coast and the Seattle North Coast Railway had it. Powell Jones, whose family home had the railway run through their backyard, claims that when he was a kid, he could run as fast as the train. He could run. Something you'll see at the end of this train is something that we don't have on trains anymore. You don't find anybody riding this train, you know. Although I'm sure that there were people that did at times. Look at that. I sat over Mount Vernon one time, I guess it was a couple of years ago, and watched an oil train go by. It must have had maybe 100, 120 cars on it. No caboose. This is the train coming down the grade, which was one of the significant grades on the rail line, coming down because it came through by where Chicken Coop is, Chicken Coop Road, and where the tribal campus is now. It came in there and then turned and went around. There were, of course, big mills over on Lake on Swim Bay at that time. But notice how it's picking up speed going downhill. This Seattle North Coast line operation was not, a great example of American railroading. They did what they needed to do to get by and try to pay their people and operate it. But, you know, they essentially went out of business and abandoned the line. So when the railway, essentially the Seattle North Coast abandoned the line and went out of business, then all of the people that owned portions of the line, in some cases, there were governmental entities that gave the railroad right of way to go through them. That went back to the governmental agencies. In some cases, the railroad sold the land to people that wanted to buy it. Usually they were adjacent landowners. In some cases, there were people that owned the land and had given the railroad an easement to get the rail line through there. It went back to the original easement. So that when the ODT people came to try and establish a rail line or a right of way, from Port Townsend out to La Push, it was very difficult. They had to go back and piece together all these little pieces because there wasn't a land grant, rail line through here. Yes. The right of way that we have here is 100 feet and 100 feet. And so it's 50 feet either side of the center line of the track. And that's where, and if I don't have a map, well, I've got a map on another program of the holding here of the park. On this side of the park, this side of the bridge, we acquired, quite a bit of property, and the tribe and various landowners have sold land to us here for the park property and the building and so forth that we put on here. But on the west side, we just own the old railway right of way. That's why the trail is there, and that's why the trail is there, and that's why we've only, we don't own anything any more than 50 feet either side of the center of the trail on the west side of the bridge. But well, probably even when the railroad was using it, was still using it, this was a party place, as you can imagine. I don't know any of you that grew up around here, whether you ever partied on the bridge or not. As you went into, as spray paint became available in the 60s and 70s, 80s, boy, it became, a hangout, a place where you did things that probably shouldn't, and you didn't want your parents to know about. I know I never did anything like that. I'm sure that the rest. But when the railroad abandoned the thing and they essentially left it and the property got distributed, they came in and stripped all of the readily salvageable pieces out of all the rails. Many people, lined their flower beds with the ties. I mean, all of this, the equipment that was easy to take off the bridge was stripped out. That's how that first picture I showed you was stripped out. So it was all dismantled. In 1990, the Trust for Public Lands stepped in with the idea because the Fish and Wildlife people and the DNR wanted the land, and there was also a movement for using the trail. The Rails to Trails program was just starting up nationally, and they wanted to establish that type of use of the old railway line. The bridge was probably within a few months of being pulled out of here and disassembled. But the Trust for Public Lands, which is a group that has modest amount of money, but they have the capability to go in and buy things with the idea that governmental agencies like states or counties and things like that can go in and buy the property back from them at a fair price, where the Trust for Public Lands has money, in hand that they can go out and secure property for a year or two. And they bought the bridge and the railway right of way, this 100-foot strip that we were talking about, and held it. And then the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and the DNR purchased it from the TPL and granted a 50-year lease to the old SARC to operate it as a park. And of course, I won't go into the discussion about what happened to SARC. That's a long, messy story. But anyway, the Trails Coalition and a bunch of volunteers in 1992 came in and decked the bridge and put handrails up and so forth, and made it so that you could safely get across on the bridge and use it for bicycles and walking and things of that nature. In '94, the tribe agreed to take the title to it because the SARC at that point really didn't have the capacity, and this was out of their principal mission area, and it was becoming a drain on them as far as manpower and expenses to come down here and clean the place up and try to take care of it. So the tribe took it over, and that was at the time that the Rain Shadow Foundation, which Annette Hansen and those folks were working with the tribe to try and establish a nature center here. Coming on the founds of that in '97, we signed the initial agreement between the National Audubon, the local Audubon Society, the Rain Shadow Foundation, and the tribe to set up a nature center here. And that's how that came to pass. In 2001, we built prior to that, we built the picnic shelter and the old amphitheater. Those were built. John's brother and I helped put that together. I don't know if you helped build the picnic shelter also. Yep. But a lot of that was done with volunteer work to put those together that used to be out here in the floodplain. And then in 2001, the building across here, which is going to be our exhibit space, when we get all that set up, was open. And then, of course, we had another small problem in 2015 when we lost part of the bridge. I've got some pictures of that in a minute. Stu McRobbie, if you remember him, he was one of our Audubon presidents and also an active volunteer down here for a lot of years. This is something that constantly happened on the old, wooden rails. These were, volunteer built handrails that were put up on the old, the western side of the bridge. And, you had trees falling into all the time. And then in 2015, we lost a big section of the bridge. It just washed out. And, the pilings, you can see pieces of them. in here. Oh, no, they're up there. You can see there are pieces of the pile vents and stuff, and it washed out. The original bridge on the concrete foundations, you can see there, that held pretty well. But the river, as rivers are wont to do, decided it wanted a new channel. And it just moved about 150 feet to the west of where the channel was underneath the bridge. And what used to be here was about every 15 to 17 feet was a vent that held up the old wooden trestle. And we replaced those, I think there was 57 of them between the end of the bridge and the far western abutment. And we replaced those with 4. 2 of them where that viewing platform is in the middle and on the other side of the bridge. This one here that is right close to the river is since relocated. It's a little bit further over here now. But that's the thing that rivers in this type of an outflow plain from the mountains are going to do. And they need to do it. It's important for them to be able to meander throughout that floodplain because it creates habitat for fish. It allows them to move gravel. It cleans the water as it does that. So it's an important component of a river to be able to maneuver like that. And that was one of the things that we decided we could have come in. We did some estimates of what it would take to get the bridge back in operation quickly and do just kind of a patch and put more pilings back in and replace what we had prior to 2015. But we decided to go in and do something that was really worthwhile. And hopefully it's going to have much more longevity to it. And I think it has proven itself to be that. And we got it opened in December 2016. And this is Ron Allen, the tribal chairman. And I don't know, of course, you do something like this, you cut ribbons, you had all kinds of politicians there. They always show up. Not to say, I don't mean me to badmouth politicians. We had a lot of politicians that helped us, with the funding, got us into the right category and supported grants and so forth to make that portion of the bridge. They use primarily transportation money, a little bit of salmon money, some insurance money, pieced it together to do that work in 2015, 2016. So this is what the reopened bridge looked like. So these are some of the dates that useful for you to kind of keep in mind. And what I'm going to do with this presentation is I'm going to provide a set of this material for the center after I fix the mistakes in it. And just some dates and some. Here's where the concrete cap pilings that are still holding the bridge up now went in. This is an important thing here in 1982, why the Seattle North Coast people still owned it. The bridge was picked up by the Department of Interior on the historic register, historic. And we were going to try and find that. I guess we didn't today, right? It's here with all of the. We had it in the old building, I hope it's not up in. I hope it's not up in the loft because it's a heavy bear. I don't want to have to lift it down those old creaky stairs. Somebody lifted it. I don't think it's up there. Paul seems to think it's back in the storeroom. This is what it looks like. But the bridge was identified and accepted on the historic register of historic places. To the best of my knowledge, there's only one other old Howe Railway truss that is still standing in the state of Washington besides this one. It's over in eastern Washington, not too far. It's off the roads and it's in private land. It's just north of Pullman, over on the far east side of the state. There are a couple of other Howe trusses. There's one down in Wycomico County that there's always been a road bridge. It was built as a road bridge. I don't think it was built until, I think it was built in the 1940s, 1950s. But this is the last one, certainly on the east side of the state or the west side of the state. And it was accepted as a, and we're gonna clean up the bridge some and get this installed on the bridge, hopefully in the not too distant future. Seems like every time we get ready to do it, they decide we're gonna do some more work on the bridge, and we don't wanna have this get in the way when they're working on construction up there. I like pictures of the bridge in snow. So that gets us, this gets us to this October. And some things I point out here. This is probably about where the amphitheater used to be, right about here, maybe a little further south. The picnic shelter used to be a little further up in there. This is a alternate side channel, and that was built as part of this project. All of these logs, if you go out there and look at them closely, are all chained in place. They've got big heavy chains and anchors. They're anchored in place in the river. And the intent here, of course, is to provide fish, breeding capability, refugia for the fish to be able to breed in. And when the river comes up, as we hope it does, we're supposed to get some rain tonight, I think. In fact, I think somebody was saying we're gonna get 35, 40 mile an hour winds tonight too. I don't know if that's gonna happen, but that was the forecast. But anyway, and then, of course, this ties back into the Discovery Trail. And this is going to be a staircase here and a activity area here that the center will be able to use for various different outdoor classes and activities. And of course, the center and the parking lot and everything. All of this is going to be revegetated. Of course, the road and so forth has been taken out. Parking lot used to be right about here. And I don't know if any of you were down here when the parking lot flooded, because it did several times in the last 10, 15 years. We had, this is some of John Gusman's work. Yeah. This is one of his drones. So you can see the bridge tied to the, I could say, here's a bridge that goes back to 1915. It's, tied to a new steel structure. And so I don't think there's a piece of timber, probably some of the steel plates and everything in it go back to 1915. But most of that timber has probably been replaced one or two times in the lifespan of, so there's probably not too many pieces that are original in that bridge. The railroads just did that on a regular basis. So that's about what I have to say for you tonight. This is, some of the old logos. This is our old logo before we got that nice one with a bird on it. And I'm happy to answer any questions or try to answer any questions for you. Yes.
Preventive maintenance capability, is the life expectancy of the housing structure indefinite, permanent?
No. Most bridges have a lifespan of about 50 to 70 years, regardless of what you make them out of. So it does require, this is going to require maintenance. I don't know how much longer it's going to last, but it's with good maintenance or repair. I don't think it's indefinite. I think probably 50 to 70 years, because you're going to get some of the failures of some of those parts and some, that piling that goes down into the river underneath the concrete cap, that's steel H piling, and it's corroding over time. So I think probably you're safe to use it for the next 50 years or so. Any other questions? Yes. The eastern terminal for the barges, I think they went to various and different sites because a lot of the mills over there had, did you hear his question? He's asking about where the other side of the barges went to when they left Fort Townsend. Some of them went into Edmonds. Some of them went as far south to some of the mills down near Tacoma. And it depended on where, you know, who had bought the cargo that they had on them and whether it was rough timber that needed to be milled. In some cases, they had finished timber that came out of some of the mills here, or it was already pre-sized and it could go to lumber yards and that type of thing. So it depended on which one of them that had bought the particular load.